Hello everyone, and welcome. Today, let us step quietly into a world where every movement mattered, every glance carried meaning, and a single misstep could echo through an entire social circle. This is not a story about grand scandals or dramatic rebellions. It is a story about rules unwritten, unspoken, yet fiercely enforced, and about how etiquette in the early 1900s shaped not only behavior, but identity itself. To understand women's lives during this period, we must begin with one central truth: etiquette was not decoration. It was survival. In the early 20th century, especially in middle and upper-class society, etiquette functioned as a social language. It told others who you were, where you belonged, and whether you deserved respect. For women, this language was unforgiving. A woman's reputation was not built on ambition, talent, or intelligence, but on her ability to perform correctness at all times. Etiquette governed how she woke up, how she dressed, how she spoke, how she ate, and even how she thought she should feel. It was not simply about politeness. It was about moral worth. From a young age, girls were taught that their value rested on perception. Being good was not enough. One had to appear good. Etiquette manuals, finishing schools, and family instruction all reinforced the same idea: society was always watching. Even when no one seemed present, an invisible audience was assumed. A woman learned to carry herself as though she were constantly on display, because in many ways, she was. Reputation did not belong solely to the individual. It reflected on her family, her future prospects, and her social circle. One mistake could quietly close doors that would never reopen. This is why etiquette became so powerful. It offered a sense of order in a rapidly changing world. Industrialization, urban growth, and shifting class boundaries created anxiety about who belonged where. Etiquette stepped in as a gatekeeper. Those who mastered its rules signaled refinement and respectability. Those who did not were marked as careless, uneducated, or morally questionable. For women, the margin for error was especially thin. A man might be excused for eccentricity or ambition. A woman, however, was expected to embody stability and restraint. Daily life became a series of small tests. How one entered a room mattered. How long one held eye contact mattered. The tone of voice used in conversation mattered. Even silence mattered. Speaking too freely could be seen as forward. Speaking too little could be interpreted as dull. The correct balance was learned through observation, correction, and, often, quiet embarrassment. Etiquette was rarely explained in full. It was absorbed through social cues, subtle disapproval, and the fear of exclusion. What made this system particularly demanding was its constant nature. There was no clear boundary between public and private behavior. A woman was expected to maintain the same level of decorum at home as she did in society. Being seen without proper attire, even by household members, was discouraged. Relaxation, in the modern sense, was not a recognized concept. The body itself was disciplined through posture, controlled movement, and carefully chosen clothing. Etiquette extended into the physical form, shaping how women sat, stood, and walked. Importantly, etiquette was framed as protection. Women were told that these rules kept them safe from gossip, from misunderstanding, from social harm. In reality, this protection came at the cost of constant self-monitoring. Emotional expression was limited. Anger, frustration, or visible ambition were considered unladylike. Even joy had to be measured. Excessive laughter or enthusiasm could attract unwanted attention. The ideal woman was calm, composed, and predictable, offering reassurance to a society deeply invested in appearances. Social success depended on mastering this performance. Invitations, friendships, and marriage prospects were all influenced by a woman's reputation for propriety. Etiquette became a form of currency. Those who possessed it moved more easily through social spaces. Those who did not were quietly edged out. This system reinforced class divisions, as learning etiquette required time, resources, and access to the right environments. For women of modest means, the pressure to appear refined was often even greater, because the risk of judgment was higher. Yet etiquette was not only imposed from above. Women also enforced it among themselves. Social circles relied on shared standards, and deviation threatened the group's stability. Correction often came in gentle forms: a raised eyebrow, a paused conversation, a polite distance, but its message was clear. Conformity was expected. In this way, etiquette became self-sustaining. It did not require constant authority. It lived in habits, expectations, and fear of social consequence. The emotional weight of this cannot be overstated. Living under such scrutiny created a constant low-level tension. Decisions that might seem trivial today, what to wear, how to greet someone, when to speak, were loaded with meaning. A woman learned to anticipate judgment before it occurred. This anticipation shaped behavior more effectively than any written rule. Etiquette worked because it was internalized. It became part of how women understood themselves. At the same time, etiquette offered a strange form of power. Mastery of its rules allowed women to navigate society with skill and subtle influence. Knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to signal approval or disapproval without direct confrontation gave women tools to manage social relationships. Within the limits imposed on them, etiquette provided a structured way to exert control. This dual nature, both restrictive and enabling, is part of what makes it so complex. However, this power was always conditional. It depended on continued compliance. A single misjudgment could undo years of careful behavior. Gossip traveled quickly, and explanations rarely mattered. Appearances outweighed intent. Once a reputation was questioned, recovery was difficult. This fragility kept women cautious. Risk-taking, whether emotional or social, was discouraged. Stability was valued over authenticity. Looking back, it is tempting to dismiss these rules as outdated or overly formal. But to do so would miss their significance. Etiquette in the early 1900s was not about manners alone. It was a system that defined womanhood itself. It shaped how women moved through the world, how they saw themselves, and how society responded to them. It taught them that worth was something to be demonstrated continuously, never assumed. As we move forward in this story, it is important to remember that these women were not simply passive followers of rules. They were participants in a complex social dance, balancing expectation and individuality, restraint and expression. Etiquette was the stage on which their lives unfolded. Understanding its importance helps us see their choices more clearly, not as weakness, but as navigation within a narrow and demanding framework. So as we continue, keep this in mind: every polite gesture, every carefully chosen word, and every controlled movement carried weight. Etiquette was not a side note to women's lives in the early 1900s. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. And once we understand that, the rest of the story begins to make sense. Good morning, in the early 1900s, did not begin with comfort or ease. For women, the day started not as a private moment of rest and renewal, but as the first test of discipline and self-control. Even before breakfast, etiquette had already taken the stage. How a woman woke up, dressed, and presented herself in the earliest hours of the day was believed to reveal her character. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a fragile concept, often secondary to appearance and propriety. In many households, especially those of the middle and upper classes, a woman was expected to be presentable almost immediately upon leaving her bedroom. Being seen with unarranged hair, without proper clothing, or in a state of visible tiredness was considered improper. The morning was not a time to be human. It was a time to be correct. Even within the family, standards were maintained. A woman was encouraged to put on a dressing gown or robe before stepping into shared spaces, ensuring that no one husband, children, or servants saw her in a state that might suggest disorder. This expectation blurred the boundary between private and public life. The home, which we often imagine as a place of relaxation, was instead an extension of the social world. Servants were present in many households, and their presence reinforced the need for constant composure. Being seen unprepared was not merely a personal matter. It was a reflection on the household's order and respectability. A woman's morning appearance was quietly judged, even if no words were spoken. Hair, in particular, carried deep symbolic weight. Loose or unstyled hair was associated with intimacy, vulnerability, or moral looseness. As a result, women were taught to secure their hair quickly and neatly before appearing in common areas. The act of grooming was not rushed, but it was also not indulgent. It followed a routine meant to restore control after sleep, which was viewed as a temporary lapse in discipline. Sleep itself was necessary, but the signs of it were not meant to linger. Even facial expressions mattered. Looking tired, irritable, or distracted was discouraged. A woman was expected to greet the day with calmness and quiet energy, regardless of how she actually felt. Emotional states were to be managed internally. Morning interactions were brief and polite, not places for complaint or vulnerability. The ideal was effortlessness, even though achieving it required effort. Etiquette manuals of the time emphasized order and cleanliness as moral virtues. A well-kept appearance signaled not only self-respect but also inner discipline. Disorder, by contrast, suggested carelessness or weak character. This belief extended to the bedroom itself. While the bedroom was technically a private space, it was still subject to standards. Beds were to be made promptly, clothing stored neatly, and personal items kept out of sight. The physical space mirrored the expectation placed on the woman herself: nothing excessive, nothing exposed. The morning routine also reflected a woman's role within the household. She was seen as the guardian of order, responsible for setting the tone of the day. If she appeared disorganized, it implied that the household itself lacked control. This responsibility added pressure to moments that should have been simple. Waking up was no longer just waking up. It was the first performance of the day. For younger women and girls, these habits were taught early. Mothers and caretakers corrected posture, reminded them to dress properly, and enforced routines that emphasized modesty and neatness. Mistakes were often met with gentle correction rather than harsh punishment, but the lesson was clear. Appearances mattered from the moment one opened one's eyes. Over time, these behaviors became automatic, shaping how women understood their own bodies and movements. What is striking is how little room there was for rest. Illness, fatigue, or emotional strain did not excuse a lapse in presentation unless they were severe enough to justify isolation. Even then, care was taken to minimize visible disruption. The expectation was resilience, expressed through composure. A woman's ability to maintain order despite discomfort was praised as strength. This loss of privacy extended beyond physical appearance. Morning thoughts, moods, and personal reflections were rarely acknowledged. Journals and quiet moments existed, but they were secondary to duty. The day's responsibilities awaited, and the morning routine was designed to transition a woman from rest to readiness without drawing attention to the transition itself. The ideal was seamlessness. From a modern perspective, this constant self-regulation may seem exhausting, and it was. Yet within that exhaustion, women found small moments of autonomy. The choice of a robe, the order of grooming, the timing of preparation, these were subtle areas where personal preference could exist. Even so, these choices remained bounded by expectation. Freedom operated within narrow lines. Morning conduct reveals how deeply etiquette penetrated daily life. It was not limited to social gatherings or public appearances. It shaped the most intimate parts of existence, teaching women that they were always visible, always evaluated. The day began not with privacy, but with preparation for judgment. As we move deeper into this world, it becomes clear that etiquette did more than dictate manners. It structured time, space, and self-awareness. The morning was not simply the start of the day. It was the reaffirmation of identity, performed quietly, consistently, and without applause. And once the day began, the performance did not pause. If the morning routine trained women to appear composed, the control of appearance throughout the day ensured that this composure never slipped. In the early 1900s, appearance was not viewed as a personal preference or a form of self-expression. It was treated as evidence. How a woman looked was believed to reveal who she was on the inside. Clothing, posture, grooming, and accessories all carried moral weight, and maintaining control over them was considered a lifelong responsibility. A woman's appearance was expected to communicate restraint, modesty, and reliability. Nothing was meant to stand out too strongly. Colors were chosen carefully, fabrics selected for appropriateness rather than comfort, and silhouettes designed to suggest dignity rather than freedom of movement. Even fashion trends, when followed, were filtered through rules of respectability. To dress incorrectly was not merely to look unfashionable. It was to risk being seen as careless or improper. Posture played a central role in this visual language. Girls were taught from a young age to stand straight, sit upright, and move with controlled grace. Slouching suggested laziness or lack of discipline. A straight back, lifted chin, and measured gestures signaled self-control. This physical discipline was reinforced through daily correction, sometimes with tools designed to encourage proper posture. Over time, the body itself became trained to obey social expectations. Hair was another powerful symbol. Styles were expected to be neat, structured, and appropriate for the woman's age and status. Loose strands or overly elaborate arrangements could attract unwanted attention. Hair was meant to frame the face without dominating it. The goal was balance visible effort without obvious vanity. Spending too much time on appearance risked being labeled shallow, while spending too little suggested neglect. Once again, the correct path lay in careful moderation. Accessories followed similar rules. Gloves, hats, and handbags were not optional decorations but essential parts of public presentation. Leaving the house without gloves, for example, could be interpreted as a breach of etiquette. Each item had its place and its time. Wearing something at the wrong hour or in the wrong setting signaled ignorance of social codes. Mastery of these details demonstrated not wealth alone, but knowledge. What made this system particularly demanding was its constancy. A woman could not relax her appearance once she was dressed for the day. Clothing was often restrictive, limiting movement and comfort, yet it was expected to remain pristine. Adjusting garments too frequently, touching one's hair in public, or appearing physically uncomfortable drew attention to the body, which etiquette sought to minimize. The ideal was for the body to be present but unnoticed. This control extended beyond clothing into facial expression. Women were expected to maintain a pleasant, neutral demeanor. Strong expressions of emotion, whether joy or frustration, disrupted the image of calm reliability. The face became another surface to manage, trained to reflect politeness rather than inner experience. Smiles were measured, laughter softened, and seriousness carefully balanced. Underlying all of this was the belief that order on the outside reflected order within. A woman who appeared neat, calm, and well-organized was assumed to be morally sound. Disorder, by contrast, suggested deeper flaws. This belief placed enormous pressure on women to manage not only their appearance, but also the impression it created. Judgment was often silent, but it was constant. Control of appearance also reinforced social hierarchy. Knowing how to dress correctly required exposure to the right environments, access to advice, and financial means. For women navigating class boundaries, appearance became a tool for acceptance or exclusion. A small mistake could reveal one's background, undermining efforts to belong. As a result, women watched one another closely, learning through observation and quiet comparison. Yet within these constraints, appearance could also offer a sense of competence. Successfully meeting expectations brought a form of security. A woman who knew she looked correct could move through social spaces with confidence, even if that confidence was carefully contained. Control became a source of pride, proof that she understood the rules and could live by them. Still, this pride came at a cost. Constant attention to appearance encouraged self-surveillance. Women learned to see themselves as others might see them, evaluating their own presentation from an external perspective. Over time, this habit shaped identity. The line between appearance and self became blurred, making it difficult to separate who one was from how one was perceived. By treating appearance as a moral indicator, early 20th century society ensured that women's bodies remained sites of regulation. Control was praised, discipline rewarded, and deviation quietly punished. Appearance was never neutral. It was a message, read and interpreted by everyone who looked. As we continue, this emphasis on outward control will help us understand why even the smallest details of daily life carried such significance. Nothing was accidental. Every visible choice contributed to a larger story about respectability, belonging, and worth. And for women of this era, that story was written on the surface, every single day. Dressing in the early 1900s was never a simple act of putting on clothes. For women, it was a ritual governed by layers, sequence, and strict social meaning. Clothing was not designed primarily for comfort or practicality, but for structure, modesty, and control. Each garment had a purpose, and wearing them incorrectly or skipping one was seen as a serious breach of etiquette. The process began with undergarments, which formed the hidden foundation of a respectable appearance. Corsets were central to this foundation. They shaped the body into the silhouette society demanded, emphasizing restraint over natural form. A properly laced corset symbolized discipline and self-control. It was meant to hold the body upright, restrict excessive movement, and create a smooth, controlled outline beneath clothing. Comfort was secondary. Endurance was praised. Over the corset came additional layers, chemises, petticoats, and slips. These layers served multiple functions. They added volume where required, prevented transparency, and ensured that the body's natural lines remained concealed. Skin was not meant to be hinted at, even indirectly. The goal was separation between the body and the outside world. Clothing acted as a barrier, reinforcing the idea that a woman's physical form was private, regulated, and not for casual viewing. The order of dressing mattered as much as the garments themselves. Each layer was put on in a specific sequence, learned through instruction and repetition. Mistakes were noticeable to those who knew what to look for. A skirt that did not fall correctly or a bodice that sat awkwardly signaled improper dressing beneath. In this way, even hidden errors became visible, reinforcing the pressure to do everything correctly. Outer garments followed the same logic of control. Dresses were designed to cover the body fully, often extending to the ankles and wrists. Necklines were modest, especially during the day. Evening wear allowed slightly more flexibility, but even then, boundaries were clear. Showing too much skin risked being labeled inappropriate, while dressing too conservatively in the wrong setting could suggest social awkwardness. Once again, balance was essential. Shoes, stockings, and gloves completed the ensemble. Stockings were always worn, regardless of weather. Bare legs were unacceptable. Shoes were chosen for appearance rather than ease of walking, reinforcing careful, measured movement. Gloves, in particular, symbolized refinement. They were worn outdoors and removed only at specific moments. Forgetting gloves was not a minor oversight. It was a visible failure to meet expectations. What made this ritual especially demanding was the time and assistance it required. Many women relied on maids or family members to help with dressing, particularly with corsets and complex fastenings. This dependence reinforced class distinctions and highlighted how appearance was supported by labor, often invisible labor. For women without help, dressing could be physically exhausting, yet the expectation remained the same. The act of dressing also reinforced a woman's awareness of her body as something to be managed. Clothing restricted bending, stretching, and even breathing. Everyday movements had to be adapted to garments, not the other way around. Over time, women learned to move within these limits, internalizing restraint as normal. The body was trained to cooperate with clothing, rather than resist it. Importantly, dressing was not only about how one looked, but about how one was judged. Clothing signaled age, marital status, and social position. Young women dressed differently from married women. Daywear differed from evening wear. Wearing the wrong style for one stage of life attracted scrutiny. Fashion, therefore, was not just seasonal. It was moral and social. Despite these restrictions, many women took pride in dressing correctly. Mastery of this complex ritual brought a sense of competence and belonging. Knowing how to assemble the correct layers for the correct occasion meant knowing one's place in society. Clothing became a language, and fluency mattered. Yet this pride existed alongside physical discomfort and constant vigilance. A loosened lace, a misplaced hem, or a visible underlayer could draw attention. The body was never allowed to forget that it was being shaped, covered, and judged. The ritual of dressing reveals how deeply etiquette reached into women's daily lives. Clothing was not simply worn. It was performed. Each layer reinforced ideals of modesty, discipline, and social order. And once fully dressed, a woman did not shed these expectations. She carried them with her, woven into fabric, posture, and movement throughout the entire day. Meals in the early 1900s were not simply about nourishment. For women, they were structured social events where etiquette was closely observed and quietly evaluated. From breakfast to formal dinners, the table became another stage on which respectability was performed. Every movement, choice, and interaction during the meal carried meaning, turning ordinary eating into a daily test of self-control and refinement. Before food was even touched, rules were already in place. Seating arrangements followed strict hierarchies based on age, status, and relationship. A woman waited to be seated and never assumed her place. Napkins were placed on the lap in a specific way, not shaken open or tucked into clothing. Posture mattered immediately. Sitting upright, without leaning on the table or crossing arms, signaled discipline and awareness of one's surroundings. Utensils formed a language of their own. Knowing which fork or spoon to use was considered basic social knowledge. Hesitation or confusion suggested inexperience. Movements were meant to be small and precise. Food was brought to the mouth, not the other way around. Bites were modest, chewing discreet, and conversation paused while eating. Drawing attention to the act of eating itself was discouraged, as it reminded others of physical needs rather than social grace. Conversation during meals followed unspoken rules. Topics were expected to be light, pleasant, and non-confrontational. Complaints, strong opinions, or personal troubles were inappropriate. A woman was expected to contribute just enough to seem engaged, but not so much that she dominated discussion. Listening attentively was as important as speaking. Silence, when appropriate, was not a failure but a sign of good manners. Even preferences were regulated. Expressing strong likes or dislikes for food could be seen as childish or ungrateful. Meals were to be accepted with appreciation, regardless of personal taste. Asking for additional seasoning or altering food at the table was discouraged. Such actions suggested fussiness or dissatisfaction, traits considered undesirable in women. Acceptance and adaptability were praised. The pace of eating also mattered. Finishing too quickly implied eagerness or lack of restraint, while eating too slowly drew attention and disrupted the flow of the meal. A woman learned to match her pace to the table, always aware of others. Coordination, not individuality, was the goal. The meal was a collective experience, and harmony was valued over comfort. For formal dinners, the pressure increased. Multiple courses required sustained focus. Fatigue, hunger, or discomfort were to be hidden. A woman was expected to remain composed for the entire duration, regardless of how long it lasted. Leaving the table early or showing impatience was unacceptable. Endurance, once again, was quietly admired. Meals within the home were no less regulated. Children, especially girls, were taught table manners early and corrected consistently. The dining table became a training ground for future social life. Mistakes were noted and remembered, reinforcing the idea that etiquette was learned through repetition and vigilance. Hosting meals added another layer of responsibility. A woman overseeing a table was judged not only on her own behavior, but on the comfort and behavior of her guests. She was expected to anticipate needs, manage conversation, and maintain a pleasant atmosphere without appearing to exert effort. Smoothness was the measure of success. What made meals particularly demanding was their frequency. Unlike special events, meals happened every day. This meant that the performance of etiquette was constant. There were few breaks from observation. Even in moments meant for rest and nourishment, self-awareness remained. Through these daily rituals, women learned to associate eating with evaluation. Hunger was managed quietly. Discomfort was hidden. Pleasure was controlled. The table taught lessons that extended beyond food, reinforcing ideals of moderation, patience, and social awareness. Meals as social tests reveal how etiquette shaped not only public gatherings, but the most routine aspects of life. Eating was transformed into a demonstration of character. And by passing these tests, day after day, women reinforced their place within a system that valued order, restraint, and appearance above all else. Stepping outside the home in the early 1900s meant entering a space of constant observation. Public life, for women, required an even higher level of self-control than the domestic sphere. Streets, shops, parks, and public buildings were places where reputation could be shaped or damaged in a matter of moments. Simply moving through the world became an act governed by etiquette, with rules that dictated how a woman walked, stood, and occupied space. Walking itself was carefully regulated. A woman was expected to take measured steps, neither too fast nor too slow. Rushing suggested nervousness or lack of composure, while lingering could be interpreted as idleness. The pace was meant to appear purposeful but unhurried. Arms were kept close to the body, gestures minimized, and posture maintained. Every movement communicated self-restraint. Eye contact was another delicate matter. Looking too directly at strangers risked being seen as bold or improper. Avoiding eye contact entirely, however, could suggest coldness or fear. The correct approach lay somewhere in between, brief, polite acknowledgement without invitation. This balance required constant awareness of one's surroundings and an understanding of social boundaries. Clothing played a direct role in shaping movement. Long skirts and structured garments limited stride length, encouraging smaller steps and controlled motion. Managing these garments was part of public behavior. A woman learned to lift her skirt slightly when necessary, without exposing too much or appearing clumsy. This action, though minor, was closely watched and judged. Public spaces also demanded emotional restraint. Expressions of frustration, excitement, or distress were discouraged. A woman was expected to remain calm and pleasant, regardless of inconvenience or discomfort. Raising one's voice, laughing too loudly, or showing irritation drew attention and risked judgment. Silence and composure were safer choices. Interactions in public were similarly regulated. Speaking to strangers, especially men, was approached with caution. Conversations were brief and polite, often limited to necessary exchanges. Lingering or appearing too familiar could invite gossip. Even when accompanied, a woman was expected to maintain appropriate distance and demeanor. The presence or absence of a companion mattered. Being seen alone was not always improper, but it required extra care. A woman alone in public had to be especially attentive to her behavior, as there were fewer social buffers to protect her reputation. Walking confidently and purposefully signaled respectability, while hesitation or wandering could raise questions. Public transport and shared spaces introduced additional challenges. Sitting, standing, and even holding onto railings were subject to unspoken rules. Physical contact was avoided whenever possible. Personal space, though limited, was carefully negotiated through posture and positioning. What made public behavior so demanding was its unpredictability. Unlike the home, public spaces could not be controlled. Unexpected encounters, weather, or delays tested a woman's ability to maintain composure. Successfully navigating these moments demonstrated social competence. Over time, these rules shaped how women experienced the world beyond their homes. Public spaces became places of vigilance rather than freedom. Movement was calculated, presence carefully managed. The body was trained to take up as little attention as possible while still appearing confident and composed. Yet within these limits, women developed strategies. Familiar routes, trusted shops, and predictable routines offered a sense of security. Mastery of public etiquette allowed some degree of independence, even if it was constrained. Public behavior reveals how etiquette extended beyond words and manners into physical existence. Walking down a street was not neutral. It was a performance of respectability, repeated daily. And through this disciplined movement, women carried the expectations of their society with them, step by careful step. In the early 1900s, greeting someone was never a casual act. For women, even the simplest social exchange was shaped by layers of etiquette that determined who spoke first, how much warmth was appropriate, and when a conversation should end. These rules transformed everyday interactions into carefully managed performances, where success depended on precision rather than spontaneity. A greeting began before words were spoken. Eye contact, posture, and timing all mattered. A woman was expected to acknowledge others politely, but not eagerly. Smiling too broadly or approaching too quickly could suggest familiarity that was not earned. Failing to acknowledge someone at all, however, risked being seen as rude or dismissive. The correct response depended on age, social rank, and relationship, and women were expected to recognize these distinctions instantly. Introductions followed strict conventions. A younger woman was introduced to an older one, never the reverse. Men were introduced to women unless social rank dictated otherwise. These rules reinforced hierarchy and ensured that women did not appear forward. Speaking out of turn during introductions or offering personal remarks too early was considered improper. Restraint was once again the guiding principle. Conversation itself was governed by balance. A woman was expected to speak clearly and pleasantly, but briefly. Dominating a conversation suggested vanity or lack of self-awareness. Remaining silent for too long, however, could imply dullness or social discomfort. The ideal was attentive participation, listening closely, responding politely, and contributing only when appropriate. Topics were carefully chosen. Safe subjects included weather, travel, books, and light observations about daily life. Controversial issues, personal struggles, or strong opinions were avoided. A woman was not meant to challenge others openly or steer conversation toward herself. Even humor was moderated. Wit was admired, but only when subtle and kind. Sharp remarks or sarcasm risked offending or drawing unwanted attention. Tone mattered as much as content. Voices were kept calm and measured. Speaking loudly was discouraged, especially in mixed company. Emotional emphasis was softened, ensuring that conversation flowed smoothly without strong peaks or disruptions. The goal was harmony, not expression. Ending a conversation required as much care as beginning one. Departing too quickly suggested impatience. Lingering too long risked inconvenience. Women learned polite phrases that signaled closure without bluntness. These verbal cues allowed social interactions to end gracefully, preserving goodwill on all sides. Greetings and conversation also served as tools of inclusion and exclusion. A brief nod could acknowledge someone without inviting interaction. A longer exchange signaled acceptance. In this way, women participated in maintaining social boundaries, often without explicit intention. Small gestures carried lasting implications. What made these interactions particularly demanding was their frequency. Social life was built on repeated encounters: neighbors, acquaintances, relatives, and guests. Each interaction reinforced or reshaped reputation. Consistency mattered. A woman known for politeness and ease was welcomed. One who misjudged tone or timing risked quiet withdrawal from social circles. These rules were learned through observation and correction rather than formal instruction. Mistakes were rarely addressed directly, but their consequences were felt. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations grew shorter. Distance replaced warmth. Over time, women learned to adjust, refining their social instincts through experience. Greeting and conversation illustrate how etiquette shaped relationships at the most basic level. Words were chosen carefully, silence used strategically, and emotion kept within acceptable bounds. Through this constant negotiation, women learned that social connection depended not on honesty or depth, but on control and awareness. And in mastering this art, they navigated a world where every interaction mattered more than it seemed. In the early 1900s, independence for women was rarely understood as freedom. Instead, it was something to be carefully managed, observed, and limited. One of the clearest expressions of this control was the widespread expectation that young women be accompanied by chaperones. The presence of a chaperone was not merely a family preference. It was a social requirement rooted in fear of misinterpretation and damage to reputation. A chaperone was typically an older woman, often a mother, aunt, or trusted family friend whose role was to supervise interactions and ensure that behavior remained beyond question. Her presence signaled respectability. It reassured society that a young woman was protected, guided, and properly raised. Without a chaperone, a woman risked appearing careless, regardless of her actual intentions. The need for supervision extended to many areas of life. Social visits, walks, outings, and especially interactions with men were all subject to oversight. Being alone with a man who was not a close relative was discouraged and, in some cases, forbidden. Even brief, innocent encounters could be reinterpreted through gossip. The chaperone existed to prevent ambiguity, acting as a visible barrier between a woman and potential suspicion. This system reinforced the idea that a woman's behavior could not be trusted to stand on its own. Respectability depended not only on what she did, but on who witnessed it. The presence of a chaperone transformed ordinary activities into approved ones. Without that presence, the same actions could be judged harshly. For young women, this supervision shaped how they experienced social life. Conversations were filtered, movements monitored, and opportunities limited. Courtship, in particular, was tightly controlled. Romantic interest was expected to develop slowly and under observation. Privacy, even emotional privacy, was restricted. Feelings were meant to be managed quietly, without visible intensity. Chaperones themselves occupied a complex position. They were both protectors and enforcers, often navigating between care and control. While many genuinely sought to shield young women from harm, they also upheld a system that limited autonomy. Their authority was rarely questioned, as it was framed as necessary and proper. The expectation of supervision extended beyond youth. Unmarried women of any age were often subject to similar scrutiny. Marriage marked a shift in supervision rather than its removal, transferring oversight from family to husband. Independence, in the modern sense, remained elusive. What made the system particularly powerful was its normalization. Being accompanied was presented as safety, not restriction. Questioning the need for a chaperone risked appearing reckless or ungrateful. As a result, many women internalized the belief that visibility equaled security, and that solitude invited judgment. Yet within these constraints, women found subtle ways to assert agency. Shared glances, coded language, and carefully timed moments allowed for limited privacy even under supervision. These small acts of autonomy reveal how women adapted rather than openly rebelled. Chaperones illustrate how etiquette extended beyond behavior into control of space and time. Where a woman could go, with whom, and for how long were all regulated. Freedom was conditional, granted only when observed. This supervision shaped not only actions, but self-perception. Women learned to see independence as something dangerous, requiring justification. And through this lesson, society reinforced the idea that a woman's reputation was too fragile to be left unguarded, even for a moment. In the early 20th century, the ideal of domestic perfection loomed over women like an invisible yet unyielding shadow. Homes were expected to be immaculate, meals carefully prepared, and children groomed to model standards of propriety. A woman's worth was often measured not in personal achievement or intellect, but in her ability to maintain the flawless appearance of her household. This pressure was omnipresent, insidious, and deeply tied to social reputation. The expectation of domestic perfection extended far beyond basic cleanliness. Furniture was polished, curtains aligned, and floors scrubbed until they gleamed. Even minor imperfections could be interpreted as a lapse in character or diligence. Women were constantly under the scrutiny of neighbors, relatives, and visiting friends, and each judgment carried weight. Gossip was not trivial. It could influence social standing, marriage prospects, and family pride. Food and meal preparation were similarly scrutinized. Dinners were not merely sustenance. They were a reflection of order, skill, and taste. Recipes were often passed down with precise instructions, emphasizing presentation as much as flavor. Meals needed to be nutritious yet elegant, filling yet refined, and the ability to achieve this balance was seen as a mark of feminine competence. Failure, whether by accident or circumstance, could invite criticism and shame. Child-rearing added another layer of pressure. Children were expected to be well-behaved, polite, and obedient at all times. A mother's reputation could be judged by her children's manners, speech, and appearance. Even subtle lapses, an unruly gesture, a mispronounced word, or a poorly chosen outfit could reflect on her ability to guide and discipline. This constant vigilance created an unrelenting mental workload, as mothers were always assessing both their own actions and those of their children. The notion of a perfect household was not simply about aesthetics or order. It was deeply tied to morality. A well-kept home symbolized virtue, diligence, and respectability. Disorder or neglect suggested moral weakness or irresponsibility. Women internalized this message, often linking their self-worth directly to the visible perfection of their domestic environment. Emotional and intellectual needs were subordinated to the upkeep of appearances. This relentless pursuit of perfection often led to exhaustion and anxiety. Many women carried the invisible burden of constant judgment, feeling pressure to present a flawless front at all times. Social gatherings, visits from relatives, and even casual interactions in the neighborhood could become sources of stress, as every small detail was subject to evaluation. Yet despite these pressures, women found ways to assert creativity and personal expression within domestic spaces. Embroidery, flower arranging, cooking variations, and home decor allowed for subtle individuality while maintaining the veneer of perfection. These small acts provided a sense of accomplishment and identity, even in an environment that demanded conformity. The ideal household also reinforced social hierarchies. Wealthier families could afford to delegate tasks to servants, but even they were not immune from societal judgment. Women of lower economic status faced a double challenge. They were expected to uphold the same standards with fewer resources. This disparity highlighted how domestic perfection was less about comfort and more about demonstrating moral and social adequacy. Ultimately, the pressure of domestic perfection created a culture in which appearances were paramount, and the true emotional, physical, and intellectual needs of women were often sidelined. The domestic sphere, celebrated as a woman's natural domain, became both a stage for social performance and a cage of expectation, illustrating how deeply societal norms could shape and limit the daily lives of women. Fashion in the early 20th century was far more than mere clothing. It was a social language, a public statement of morality, status, and femininity. Women's bodies were scrutinized not just for health or functionality, but for their ability to conform to ever-shifting ideals dictated by society. Corsets, tightly laced bodices, and structured garments dictated posture, silhouette, and even breathing patterns, all in the name of achieving a socially approved form. The pressure to embody these ideals was relentless, shaping daily routines, self-perception, and social interactions. Clothing often dictated the physical and emotional experiences of women. Corsets, for example, were worn to create the hourglass figure celebrated at the time, emphasizing a narrow waist and accentuated hips and bust. While fashionable, these garments restricted breathing, reduced mobility, and could cause discomfort or long-term health issues. Yet the discomfort was largely ignored in the pursuit of social acceptance, demonstrating the lengths women were expected to go to fit an ideal image. In many ways, fashion became a silent enforcer of societal norms, controlling bodies as much as minds. Beauty standards extended beyond clothing into grooming, hairstyle, and makeup. Women were expected to maintain a flawless complexion, often using powders, creams, and hair treatments to conceal imperfections. Hairstyles were not simply a personal choice, they were markers of social status and sophistication. Long, styled hair required careful maintenance and regular attention, adding to the invisible labor of femininity. Even small deviations from these norms could invite scrutiny or subtle judgment, reinforcing conformity. Societal pressure to maintain these appearances intersected with emerging consumer culture. Advertisements and magazines constantly promoted products promising slender figures, smooth skin, and fashionable wardrobes. This created a cycle of aspiration and dissatisfaction, where women were both idealized and judged by standards largely dictated by external forces. The sense that one's body was never quite adequate fueled anxiety and a desire for constant adjustment. Clothing also served as a tool of social signaling. The right dress could convey respectability, wealth, and moral standing, while the wrong choice, too simple, too elaborate, or too casual, could result in social censure. Fashion became a way to navigate public life, manage perceptions, and assert belonging within a community. Women learned to read and respond to these unspoken rules, balancing personal preference with societal expectation. Importantly, the obsession with fashion and body image had a psychological dimension. Many women internalized the belief that their value was directly tied to appearance, creating long-lasting impacts on self-esteem and identity. The daily ritual of dressing, grooming, and perfecting one's look was not merely aesthetic. It became a reflection of self-discipline, morality, and social adequacy. Deviating from these norms was often experienced as personal failure, even if the standards themselves were arbitrary or unattainable. Despite the pressures, women often found ways to express individuality and creativity through style. Subtle variations in accessories, fabric patterns, or hairstyles allowed for personal statements within the constraints of societal norms. Fashion became a paradoxical space, both a tool of control and a medium for self-expression, highlighting the complexity of women's lived experiences. Ultimately, the influence of fashion and body image extended beyond superficial appearances. It shaped women's movements, health, mental well-being, and social interactions, embedding itself deeply into the fabric of daily life. By dictating how women should look and behave, these ideals reinforced broader societal hierarchies and expectations, illustrating the profound connection between personal appearance and cultural power structures. Education for women in the early 20th century was a battleground of opportunity and limitation. While access to schools and literacy had improved compared to previous generations, societal expectations still placed boundaries on what women were encouraged or even allowed to learn. The prevailing belief was that women's primary roles were domestic, managing households, raising children, and supporting husbands. Academic pursuits, scientific study, or intellectual exploration were often deemed unnecessary or even inappropriate, creating an environment where knowledge was filtered through the lens of gendered expectations. Schools for girls often emphasized accomplishments over rigorous academic subjects. Music, art, sewing, and etiquette were prioritized, seen as refinements that would prepare women for social presentation rather than intellectual independence. While these skills had cultural value, they reinforced the notion that women's worth was tied to aesthetics and domestic competency rather than critical thinking or professional contribution. In contrast, boys were encouraged to study mathematics, science, and philosophy, preparing them for careers and public life, highlighting a systemic imbalance in opportunity. Yet, even within these restrictions, women found ways to pursue knowledge and personal growth. Reading became a private sanctuary, where novels, newspapers, and journals offered glimpses of broader worlds, ideas, and debates. Libraries and literary societies, though limited in accessibility, served as spaces for women to engage with new ideas, challenge conventions, and connect with like-minded peers. This pursuit of knowledge, even when constrained, was an act of subtle rebellion, asserting intellectual agency within a society that often undervalued it. Education also intersected with activism. Women who gained literacy and access to higher learning became crucial voices in movements for suffrage, labor rights, and social reform. Understanding law, history, and political theory empowered women to challenge oppressive structures and advocate for change, demonstrating that education was not merely personal enrichment but a tool of societal transformation. The intellectual awakening of women contributed to reshaping cultural narratives about gender, capability, and authority. However, access to education was uneven. Class, race, and geography influenced who could attend schools or pursue intellectual endeavors. Affluent women had greater access to tutors, boarding schools, and universities, while working-class women often balanced labor and domestic duties, leaving little room for formal study. These disparities reinforced existing social hierarchies, illustrating how systemic factors limited the reach and impact of educational opportunities. The value of knowledge extended into daily life as well. Women who were educated in nutrition, hygiene, and child-rearing practices could influence the well-being of families and communities. Yet even this practical application was intertwined with expectations of moral duty, demonstrating how knowledge was framed as a tool to serve others rather than for personal development alone. Intellectual curiosity was often subordinated to social utility, reinforcing gendered boundaries on learning. Importantly, the struggle for education shaped women's identities and aspirations. The pursuit of knowledge offered a sense of autonomy, self-worth, and empowerment, challenging the notion that a woman's sphere should be limited to the domestic. It also created tension between personal ambition and societal expectation, a balance that many women navigated with both courage and ingenuity. Education became both a path to freedom and a lens through which the inequities of society were revealed. In essence, education in the early 20th century was a double-edged sword for women, a source of potential liberation and a reflection of societal limitation. It shaped how women understood themselves, their possibilities, and the world around them. By valuing and seeking knowledge, women began to redefine the boundaries of gender, carving out spaces for intellectual growth and influence that would resonate for generations to come. The societal expectations placed on women in the early 20th century were more than temporary norms. They left enduring imprints on women's identities, choices, and self-perception. These expectations, often invisible yet omnipresent, dictated how women behaved, what they valued, and how they measured success. Conformity to ideals of beauty, morality, domesticity, and subservience became a kind of silent contract, influencing daily decisions from appearance to education, relationships, and career aspirations. Women learned to navigate a world where deviation from norms could lead to judgment, social exclusion, or limited opportunities, creating an ongoing tension between personal desires and societal approval. The pressure to maintain appearances and uphold family honor was deeply internalized. Women's self-worth often became entangled with their ability to adhere to social codes, a dynamic reinforced by peers, family, and media. Failure to meet these standards, whether through appearance, behavior, or achievement, could provoke shame or criticism, shaping emotional landscapes marked by self-monitoring, anxiety, and resilience. In this way, societal expectations acted not only as external pressures but also as psychological frameworks through which women evaluated themselves daily. Yet, within these constraints, women demonstrated remarkable agency. Many found ways to assert individuality while appearing to conform, subtly challenging norms through personal style, intellectual engagement, or private ambitions. Others participated in collective movements, suffrage campaigns, labor activism, and educational reform, using their voices to question and reshape societal definitions of womanhood. These acts, whether small or monumental, created ripples that gradually altered perceptions, paving the way for greater freedom and recognition in future generations. The influence of societal expectations also extended into health, wellness, and lifestyle choices. Women were often instructed to prioritize domestic labor, caregiving, and appearance over personal fulfillment, leading to physical and emotional exhaustion. Dieting trends, exercise regimens, and beauty rituals were often framed as moral obligations or markers of virtue rather than individual preference, illustrating how deeply control over women's bodies was embedded in cultural values. These pressures had tangible consequences, shaping habits, self-image, and mental health, effects that sometimes persisted across a lifetime. Importantly, these norms were not monolithic. They intersected with class, race, and geography, creating varied experiences for different women. Affluent women faced intense scrutiny regarding appearance and social comportment, while working-class women contended with practical survival pressures alongside societal judgment. Women of color and marginalized communities faced compounded expectations, navigating both racial and gendered constraints in a society structured around inequity. Recognizing this complexity is essential to understanding the full impact of historical expectations on women's lives. Reflecting on the legacy of these societal pressures helps explain contemporary conversations around gender, identity, and autonomy. Many modern debates body positivity, professional equality, reproductive rights trace their roots to the historical frameworks that shaped women's experiences. Understanding the past illuminates why certain struggles persist and how cultural norms evolve slowly over generations. It also highlights the resilience of women who navigated oppressive expectations while laying the groundwork for future empowerment. Ultimately, the story of societal expectations is a story of tension between limitation and agency. Women internalized pressures, yet also resisted them in myriad ways. Their lives were defined not only by what society demanded but by the choices, adaptations, and rebellions they enacted within and against those demands. Recognizing this nuanced interplay provides a deeper appreciation of women's historical experiences and the ongoing influence of cultural expectations on identity, opportunity, and self-expression. In conclusion, the story of societal expectations in the early 20th century is far more than a historical footnote. It is a window into the intricate ways culture, norms, and pressures shaped women's lives. From the constant scrutiny over appearance and behavior to the subtle forms of resistance and agency, women navigated a complex world that both constrained and defined them. These experiences left lasting imprints on their identities, choices, and perceptions of self-worth, reminding us that the pressures of the past echo into the present, influencing how society understands gender, autonomy, and personal freedom today. As we reflect on these stories, we can appreciate the resilience, creativity, and determination of women who, despite the weight of expectation, carved out spaces for individuality, change, and empowerment. Their lives invite us to think critically about the norms we accept today and encourage us to foster a society that values authenticity over conformity and understanding over judgment. Thank you all for joining me on this journey into history. I hope this story inspires reflection on how far we have come and how much further we can go in creating a world where every person can thrive beyond societal pressures. See you in the next story.